He was a national hero, a warrior bathed in glory, a man who rode beside Joan of Arc and helped shape the future of France. But when the castles fell silent and the war ended, something inside Gilles de Rais began to twist. Behind velvet curtains and locked iron doors, he built his own world, one of rituals, whispers, and unimaginable cruelty. They called it madness. Some said it was evil. But what if it was something else? Why did dozens of children go missing wherever he stayed? Why were their names found carefully written in a book hidden beneath his bed? Why did he speak of spirits in crimson robes who demanded a pure offering before they would give him power? And most disturbing of all, what did he mean when he said, "They didn't die, I transformed them"? This is the forgotten story of France's golden soldier, the one history tried to bury because the truth was worse than any myth. Stay with us until the end. What you'll hear in the final confession will haunt you long after the screen goes black. The legend and the face of the monster in the dim corridors of time. Buried beneath centuries of dust and myth lies a name that still breathes unease into the world. It is not whispered in reverence, nor shouted in accusation. It lingers, like a shadow caught between candlelight and darkness. That name is Gilles de Rais. To speak of him is to stir questions, to answer cleanly. Was he a war hero crowned in gold and glory? Or was he something far more unsettling, a figure cloaked not just in velvet and armor, but in secrets too grotesque for daylight? His story does not begin with crimes. It begins with brilliance. Born into nobility around the turn of the 15th century, Gilles arrived into a world that balanced refinement and violence with the elegance of a sword dancer. Castles gleamed with stained glass, and blood halls echoed with both laughter and screams of the battlefield. The young heir of the House of Montmorency-Laval was not just destined for greatness, he was trained to believe it was his birthright. The wealth surrounding him was almost obscene in its abundance. Fortresses rising like stone titans across Brittany and Anjou, vassals who bent the knee with practiced fear, and a lineage that stretched back to the first flickers of feudal France. His family's ambitions were molded into him, into a blade. Every lesson he received, every alliance his guardians arranged, every duel he witnessed was another stone set into the towering identity being constructed around him. Gilles was not merely noble, he was to be magnificent, and for a time, he was. France in the early 1400s was chaos layered upon catastrophe. War with England had dragged on for decades in a struggle so convoluted that even nobles struggled to trace its origins anymore. The countryside was a stitched-together corpse of occupied cities, ruined harvests, and men who called themselves kings, while others died in their names. Disease crept in from the seaports, while betrayal and ambition poisoned the court from within. No one was safe, no one was innocent, and in this broken landscape, young Gilles found purpose not through peace, but through war. By his early 20s, he had proven himself on the field, not just as a fighter, but as a force. Witnesses described him as a golden storm, clad in radiant armor so finely crafted, it looked ceremonial until he charged. He was fearless, almost unnervingly so. His command of soldiers was instinctive, brutal, effective. Tales began to spread, murmured first by squires, and then sung by poets. The noble with the face of an angel and the fury of a tempest. But fate, ever theatrical, rarely let such figures rise alone. It was in 1429, at the French court drenched in anxiety and politics, that Gilles de Rais first laid eyes on the girl who would forever bind his name to legend. She was young, unpolished, and barefoot, a peasant girl from Domremy, claiming to hear voices from heaven, claiming to be sent by divine will to drive the English from French soil and crown the Dauphin as king. Her name was Jean. History would remember her as Joan of Arc. Most of the court saw madness in her eyes. Some saw danger. Gilles saw something else. He saw belief. She did not speak with fear or reverence. She spoke with certainty. Gilles, a man raised on strategy and doubt, found himself strangely drawn to that unwavering gaze. Not because he believed in visions, but because he believed in momentum. Joan was a storm, and he understood storms. Their alliance was not orchestrated by lords or letters. It was born in the quiet moments between battles, in the shared recognition of war's ugliness and necessity. While others scoffed at Joan, Gilles listened. When others hesitated, he followed. And together, they did the impossible. At Orleans, they broke the English siege, not with overwhelming numbers or superior arms, but with sheer audacity. Gilles led the charge, if the earth itself bent beneath his horse's hoofs. The sight of him gilded, blooded, unstoppable became a kind of prophecy in motion. Behind him, Joan's banner waved not like cloth, but like judgment. The people loved her, the soldiers feared him. The two together became myth made flesh. But even in triumph, whispers began, not about Joan, about him. It started with strange reports. Gilles taking reckless risks, fighting not to win but to tempt fate. His tents more luxurious than necessary. His household swelling with young boys, artists and singers. His patronage of the arts turned extravagant, his spending frantic. No one dared question him, not yet. But the air around him began to change. He had the loyalty of his troops, the gratitude of a future king, and the halo of war-given glory. Still, some said he smiled too widely in battle, that his prayers before a siege sounded too close to threats, that the blood on his sword dried too slowly. When Joan was captured, he offered gold and favors for her release. None of it worked. She was handed to her enemies, condemned not as a warrior, but as a heretic. She was consumed by flames, as the people watched in silence. Gilles did not attend her execution, but something in him did. The light that had once gilded his armor began to tarnish. He no longer marched at the head of armies. He retreated instead to his estates, to his labyrinth of castles scattered across the countryside, like silent monuments to a past he could not outrun. Behind those walls, something changed, or perhaps something revealed itself. There were no longer parades or victories. Instead, there were private plays where Gilles acted in costumes of angels and devils. There were feasts where the guests were unnervingly young. There were whispers among the servants of rooms locked from the inside, of strangers arriving at dusk and never seen again. Still, the law did not knock at his gates. Not yet. He was too important, too powerful, too connected. And so, the door remained closed. Behind it, the air thickened. Behind it, the future waited. And somewhere deep within those cold stone halls, Gilles de Rais, once the golden hero of France, began a different kind of campaign. Not for kings or crowns, not for country, but for something much darker, something that does not bleed easily under sunlight, something that watches in silence, while history chooses whether to call it legend or nightmare. The air within Gilles de Rais castles grew colder, not from the stone or the northern winds that battered the moats and towers, but from something else, something unspoken. Life on his estates continued outwardly, as one might expect for a man of his station. The stables remained filled, the kitchens prepared lavish meals, and his courtiers and retainers went about their duties with ceremonial respect. But beneath that surface like rot, beneath polished wood, whispers began to spread. They did not start with violence, they started with extravagance. In the grand halls of Machecoul and Tiforges, Gilles began hosting elaborate performances, part theatre, part religious passion play, part something else entirely. Costumes of gold-threaded silk, backdrops painted by renowned artists, and choirs composed entirely of boys, imported from across his territories. These performances were not mere entertainment. They were events, spectacles designed to bend attention toward himself. He would star in the productions, often in roles of divinity or damnation, his booming voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings, while eyes watched from candlelit benches, some with awe, others with apprehension. He funded these spectacles with a desperation that alarmed even his most loyal stewards. Chests of coin were emptied to build rotating stages, commission rare instruments, and pay salaries many times the going rate. The scale of his spending began to devour his wealth, and as his accounts drained, his behavior became more erratic. Advisors dared to speak in hushed tones about finances. He dismissed them with a sharpness that left no room for return. He began to withdraw. The grand halls were still cleaned and polished, but he appeared in them less and less. Entire wings of his castles were locked, sealed with heavy chains and guarded by men who answered only to him. Guests were no longer allowed to roam freely. Servants were instructed to deliver food to certain areas without knocking, and to leave promptly without making eye contact. At night, the corridors filled with sounds that did not belong. Rhythmic chanting in unknown languages, low murmurs behind thick wooden doors, screams, short and sharp, abruptly cut off. At first, those who heard them convinced themselves it was wind or drunken mischief. But night after night, the sounds returned, and each time they felt closer. It was during this time that a new figure entered Gilles' circle, a man who did not belong among the nobility, and yet was welcomed as if he were royalty himself. Francesco Prelati. He claimed to be an Italian scholar, trained in the hidden sciences of the East, a man of letters and flame. But he was no ordinary alchemist. His eyes were sharp in a way that suggested calculation rather than curiosity. He wore the robe of a cleric and the grin of a man who knew how to sell faith to the desperate. Gilles welcomed him eagerly. To those who had been near Gilles during his campaigns, this was startling. The baron, who had once held fast to the church, who had fought under banners blessed by priests, now sought knowledge from a man whose rituals involved symbols etched in blood, circles of ash, and languages lost to time. Prelati spoke of ancient forces neither divine nor demonic, but elemental. He claimed that power was not given by God, but seized through ritual, that the spiritual world could be bent with the right sacrifices. He spoke of conjuring guardians, of spirits who would bring untold wealth, if only the correct offering was made. Gilles listened, not with skepticism, but with hunger. He had spent nearly all he had. His lands, once fertile with crops and gold, were riddled with debt. His glory from the war had faded into memory. The king no longer called. The people no longer cheered. He was still powerful, yes, but power, once tasted in its fullest bloom, does not accept reduction quietly. He wanted more. He wanted everything, and Prelati had come to offer it. Their rituals began modestly, at least, by their standards. A circle of chalk, a few candles, some obscure incantations in Latin and Greek. But quickly, they escalated. Blood became necessary, not symbolic, but real. At first, it came from animals, goats, chickens, pigs. Then Prelati claimed the spirits required more, that to truly awaken the forces capable of restoring Gilles' fortune, the offering had to be pure. That word echoed differently in Gilles' mind. He had always been drawn to the young, their energy, their awe, the way they could be shaped. It had begun during the war, when boys too young to carry swords had looked up to him if he was something more than flesh. He had protected some. He had sent others to die. Now, in the cold silence of his halls, those same eyes returned, not as soldiers but as offerings. The first boys arrived under pretense. Pages, singers, choir members. They were invited from nearby villages, selected with care. Their families were promised wages, education, even letters of recommendation to the court. For peasants, it was salvation. They never came back. Servants began to notice patterns. New boys would arrive, always beautiful, always between the ages of 6 and 16. They would be fed, clothed, sometimes even paraded through the castle as if they were royalty. But then, after days or weeks, they vanished. No explanations, no farewells. At first, staff said nothing. A servant's silence was often a form of self-preservation. But when the disappearances became frequent enough to be undeniable, the atmosphere of the castle began to shift. Those who had worked there for decades avoided certain rooms. Torches were left unlit at night. Doors were locked from the outside. Even the animals seemed disturbed. Dogs that once followed Gilles without hesitation now growled at him, tails tucked, eyes wide. Prelati, meanwhile, remained. He became a ghostly figure in the halls, always watching, always calm. He claimed they were on the edge of a great breakthrough, that the rituals were working, that the dreams were getting stronger. Gilles became obsessed. He stopped attending mass. He spoke often of dreams, where beings in crimson robes whispered secrets into his ears. He wrote compulsively, pages filled with sigils and strange poetry. He began to believe that each child he offered brought him closer to the gate. One chamber deep beneath the foundations of his oldest castle became his temple. No one was allowed near it. Only he and Prelati descended into it, sometimes 4 hours, sometimes for entire nights. On rare occasions, Gilles would emerge with blood on his robes, eyes wide and unfocused. He would walk past his retainers without acknowledgement, as though returning from a place beyond memory. The villagers, of course, began to talk. Mothers clutched their children tighter when messengers from the castle arrived. Fathers stopped offering their sons for service. Doors were barred at night, and children were told tales of a creature who wore velvet and smiled so widely. Still, boys kept disappearing, not just from Gilles' immediate lands, but from miles around. Some were orphans. Others came from families desperate enough to ignore their instincts. All of them were chosen. All of them were beautiful. All of them vanished. Inside the sealed rooms of his castle, rituals continued. Some involved fire, others silence. Gilles began collecting objects, locks of hair, garments, portraits. He kept ledgers not of debts, but of offerings. He recorded names, ages, physical traits, and the dates of their disappearances. These were not the scribblings of a madman. They were organized, methodical. It was said that he would speak to the remains, that he believed they answered, that they forgave him, that they promised more. And yet, despite the mounting terror, no one dared confront him. To accuse a baron, a former Marshal of France, was political suicide. He had fought beside saints. He had crowned kings. His lands were vast. His name still carried weight. But even weight, when it leans too far, can collapse. The first crack came not from a scream or a body, but from a property dispute. It would be that simple. A legal technicality, an argument over a chapel. And through that crack, the whole of Gilles' world would begin to unravel. The spark that would burn the curtain down was not a scream in the night, nor a grieving mother's accusation. It was parchment. Dry, brittle, bureaucratic parchment. In the spring of 1440, Gilles de Rais sold a portion of his land, specifically a church property near St. Dash, to a local clergyman. The transaction seemed minor by the standards of feudal France. Nobles traded properties regularly, often in haste to pay off debts or by favor. But in this case, Gilles had failed to obtain the necessary permission from his feudal superior, Jean V, Duke of Brittany. It was an oversight, or perhaps an act of defiance, but the consequences were immediate. When church authorities attempted to take possession of the building, they found it guarded, not just symbolically, but militarily. Armed men under Gilles' banner stood at the gates, refusing entry. Tempers flared. The priest who had purchased the property was mocked, shoved, and forcibly turned away. He returned the next day with reinforcements, less with soldiers and more with words. Legal threats, ecclesiastical curses. Gilles responded not with compromise but with fury. He arrived himself, leading an armed band into the village like a knight charging into battle. The scene that followed was a parody of the battlefield glories he had once known. Villagers screaming, clergy scrambling, doors being kicked open. The priest and his retinue were violently expelled. Sacred items were thrown from the building, the altar defaced. To the eyes of the church, it was not just property violation, it was desecration. And that, finally, could not be ignored. The church had tolerated the whispers. The Duke had looked past the disappearances, but an attack on ecclesiastical authority struck at the root of both spiritual and temporal power. The response was swift. Letters were sent. Meetings were held in private chambers with wax seals and guarded doors. The Duke had been waiting. Some would later say waiting for the right moment. Gilles was wealthy, but drowning in debt. His land was vast, but fractured. He had no legitimate heir. His fortune, if seized, could be absorbed without legal complication. All that was needed was a reason. Now they had one. On September 15, 1440, without public fanfare or prior warning, Forces loyal to the Duke of Brittany arrived at the gates of the Château de Machecoul. No trumpet sounded, no proclamation was read, just steel, footsteps, and orders. Gilles de Rais was arrested. Simultaneously, across his estates, other doors were broken open. Francesco Prelati, the Italian who had whispered of demons and fortunes, was seized. So too was the most trusted household staff Etienne Corot, known as Poitou, and Henriette de Gris, his steward. Men who had been shadows behind his throne were now dragged into the light. The operation was exact, coordinated, planned. The shock was immediate. Across France, nobles gasped not with grief, but with calculation. Some saw opportunity, others felt fear. If a Marshal of France could be shackled like a thief, what protected them? But the true horror had not yet surfaced. The charges, at first, were limited: illegal property transaction, disruption of ecclesiastical order. It was enough to justify the arrest. It was enough to put him on trial. But the authorities already knew there was more. Within days of Gilles' imprisonment, investigators arrived at his castles. They were churchmen, soldiers, scribes, some armed with spears, others with ink and trembling hands. Their task was simple: find proof of wrongdoing. What they discovered would shake even the most battle-hardened among them. It began with the stench. In the lower levels of Machecoul, sealed behind doors that had not been opened in years, they found chambers built with no purpose but isolation. Stone walls lined with chains, drainage trenches carved into the floor, hooks mounted at specific intervals. In one corner, a metal table, polished and scarred. The rooms had been cleaned, or rather, burned. Fires had been set in the hearths to erase what had been done. Ash covered much of the stone, but there were fragments that could not be destroyed: bone, cloth, tools of strange design, and the smell sickly sweet, cloying, unforgettable. In another wing, they found what could only be described as a shrine: glass jars filled with preserved objects, some no larger than a child's hand, a series of shells bearing sketches, names, symbols, candles burned to the nub beside bones, laid out in meticulous patterns, Latin phrases scrawled in charcoal across the walls, mixed with sigils no priest could recognize. At first, the men hesitated to believe what they were seeing. Then they began to dig. Outside, the soil was soft. One by one, they found them. Shallow graves, some with more than one occupant, some tightly wrapped, others exposed to the earth. Skulls lined in rows like trophies. Small garments, mostly intact. Rings once given to calm frightened children, now rusted and embedded in decay. It was not 1, it was not 10, it was not 50. No one could agree on the final number. The estimates would vary for centuries, but as investigators exhumed remains from every corner of Gilles' estate, from his castles in Tiforges, Champtuc, and beyond, the evidence became undeniable. Something terrible had happened here, something prolonged, systematic, ritualized, and it had happened for years. The servants who were arrested broke first. Faced with the same threat of punishment their master now endured, they began to speak. The testimonies came in waves, each one worse than the last. They described the selection process, the way Gilles' agents traveled the countryside, identifying boys who met his criteria: beauty, youth, vulnerability. How families were approached with offers too generous to refuse. How the boys were dressed, fed, groomed. How they were kept 4 days, sometimes longer. Then came the ceremonies. Henriette de Gris, with tears in her eyes, spoke of being ordered to prepare the rooms, lighting the candles, cleaning the floors afterward. Poitou described the Baron descending into the lower chambers alone, robed as if for mass. How he sometimes sang. How he never locked the door from the inside because no one ever tried to escape. They spoke of the instruments, devices shaped like those used in medieval interrogation, but smaller, designed for children. One chamber had walls stained a deep brown that no one could clean. Another had chains so fine they could restrain even the smallest wrists. Prelati remained silent longest. When he finally spoke, he painted a portrait of theology twisted beyond recognition. He claimed the rituals were necessary, that they were close to summoning something ancient, that the children's light was needed to pierce the veil between worlds. He did not use the word sacrifice, he used the word invitation. He described Gilles not as a madman, but as a man chosen, touched, destined to cross into a realm beyond mortal pain or reason. The court scribes struggled to keep up. Some could not finish their notes. Others wept openly. The trial would begin soon, but the nation was already watching, and the truth for whatever passed for it was too monstrous to look away from. It began not with a scream in the dark, nor with the sudden absence of a child, but with a signature on a deed-won parchment to many. In the spring of 1440, Gilles de Rais entered into a property dispute with the church. It was not unusual for nobles to argue over land, especially with ecclesiastical authorities, who had their own courts, their own armies, and their own sense of sanctified entitlement. What was unusual was Gilles' reaction. The church of Saint-Jean-de-Mer-Moteur had been a small, unimposing structure on the edge of his domain. Gilles had sold it without proper authorization from his liege lord, the Duke of Brittany. This misstep might have been brushed aside with apologies and penance had Gilles not responded with fury. When church representatives came to claim the property, they were met not with diplomacy, but with weapons. Gilles, surrounded by armed retainers, stormed the grounds and forcibly ejected the clerics. Witnesses would later describe the scene as surreal. Sacred vessels shattered on the stone floor, priests weeping as soldiers dragged them from the altar. Gilles himself shouting oaths not heard since the battlefield. The message was unmistakable. Gilles de Rais no longer feared God or men. This act of sacrilege, blasphemy, and defiance rippled outward with alarming speed. The church could not ignore it, and neither could the Duke. Jean V, Duke of Brittany, had long harbored concerns about Gilles' behavior. The rumors surrounding his lands had become too loud to ignore. Missing children, unusual guests, hermetically sealed castle wings. The baron's wealth had dwindled, his debts swelled, and his conduct had turned openly confrontational. Where once he had been a loyal servant of the crown, now he was an unpredictable liability. But more than that, he was vulnerable. Gilles de Rais had no surviving heir. His fortune had withered. His influence had diminished. If the Duke moved against him now, the baron's lands would revert to the crown, his debts dissolved, and a dangerous loose end neatly severed. All that was needed was a legal justification. The church gave it to him. Within weeks, plans were set in motion. Quietly, strategically, agents of the Duke travelled to Gilles' lands under the pretense of ecclesiastical business, but they came with questions sharper than their quills. They spoke to villagers, they visited markets, they asked after children, they recorded names, many names, and what they found was not one case of disappearance, but dozens. Each family, isolated by distance and fear, had kept their grief quiet. A missing son could mean many things: wolves, war, hunger. But now, when these stories were placed side by side, a pattern emerged. Boys taken into service, boys invited to sing, boys promised a better life, all gone, and all of them connected to Gilles de Rais. On the morning of September 15, 1440, the trap was sprung. Soldiers loyal to the Duke descended upon the castle of Machecoul. The air was brittle with tension. Orders had been given: seize the Baron alive, take his inner circle, and search the grounds. No delays, no warnings, no blood unless absolutely necessary. Gilles did not resist. Perhaps he thought it a misunderstanding. Perhaps he believed his title still protected him. Perhaps he knew the reckoning had simply arrived. He was arrested alongside several of his closest confidants: Francesco Prelati, the alchemist priest who would become his spiritual guide, Henry Gris, a long-serving valet, and Chien Correlault, better known as Poitou, a man whispered to be Gilles' most trusted enforcer. As they were taken from the castle, guards entered the sealed wings. What they found behind those doors would silence even the most hardened among them. The air was wrong, thick, still, a foul mix of smoke, rot, and something sweet and natural in the way of perfumes left too long in the sun. Tapestries once vibrant with religious scenes were stained dark and sagging. The stone beneath their feet bore marks, grooves cut into the floors, circles etched with chalk and soot, some smeared with a brown-black residue. Then came the rooms. The first chamber they opened appeared at first to be a study. Shelves of books in Latin and Greek, scrolls, candles burned down to stubs. But on closer inspection, they noticed the tools, scalpels too small for surgery, vessels designed to catch liquid, tables scored with grooves. Further in, another room, this one colder, and their remnants, bones, small ones, carefully arranged, like specimens in a cabinet of curiosities. Then came the pits, shallow, square, filled with ash and charred debris. Some showed the outline of rib cages, the curve of skulls. In the far corner of one chamber, investigators found a shelf lined with objects that defied rational explanation. Glass jars containing hair, bundles of teeth tied with silk cords, and what appeared to be preserved heads desiccated, yet intact, as though embalmed not by nature, but by ritual. Some guards vomited, others wept. One knight, a veteran of Agincourt, reportedly left the castle without a word and never spoke of what he saw. Outside, the villagers began to gather. Word spread like fire across the countryside. The Baron had been arrested. The Baron had been hiding something. The Baron might not be the man they once cheered. Within a week, multiple trials were prepared. Unusually, the charges would be handled by both secular and ecclesiastical courts. The church pursued allegations of heresy, sacrilege, and sorcery. The state would handle the rest: murder, deception, malice on a scale previously unimaginable. The investigations moved swiftly, perhaps too swiftly. Testimonies poured in from former servants. Men who had once sworn silence now poured out their confessions in full. Some claimed they had participated in the abductions. Others confessed to cleaning the aftermath, disposing of remains, washing linens, burying ash in hidden places. Some were motivated by guilt, others by fear, still others by the faint hope that cooperation might spare them the worst of punishments. The image that emerged was one of structure, system, organization. This was no impulsive spree. This was a machine, a network. Each participant had a role: recruiter, guard, cleaner, watcher. Each ritual followed a process. Each chamber had its purpose, and at the center of it all was Gilles, calm, methodical, even joyful. He was said to have spoken to his victims softly, asked about their families, their dreams. He offered them food, clothes, kind words. Then he prepared them. Then he offered them for wealth, for power, for voices that only he and Prati could hear. But perhaps most chilling was the confession that Gilles kept ledgers not of coin, but of victims, names, ages, descriptions, notes in the margins about their qualities. It was these records, combined with physical evidence and testimony, that broke the courts. The trial of Gilles de Rais began on October 13, 1440, in Nantes. The courtroom was packed. Nobles, priests, peasants all came to see the man who had once stood beside Joan of Arc, now shackled in chains. He arrived robed, composed, and smiling faintly. His confidence did not falter. He denied everything. At first, the court presented witness after witness, evidence, documents, artifacts pulled from the bowels of his castle. Gilles scoffed. He mocked the proceedings, reminded the judges of his titles, his service to the realm, his friendship with saints. But then the church raised a different threat: excommunication. To a man like Gilles, steeped in ritual, obsessed with legacy, this was not a punishment, it was annihilation. It meant erasure not just from society, but from eternity. The threat broke him, and so he confessed, not in stutters or shamed mutterings. In detail, with clarity, he described the rituals, the methods, the symbols and tools. He explained how the children were chosen, how their families were deceived, how their lives ended in flame and salt and silence. He named his accomplices. He explained their roles. He did not weep. He did not plead. He narrated. The courtroom, once filled with whispers, fell into funereal silence. People wept openly. Others stared in disbelief. unable to reconcile the words with the man speaking them. One priest reportedly fainted. In the weeks that followed, more remains were found. More children were named. More details emerged that cannot and perhaps should not be repeated. The darkness was no longer a whisper. It had form, weight, and voice. And at its center, still wearing the title of Marshal of France, stood Gilles de Rais. The fracture in Gilles de Rais' life came without fanfare. No thunder announced it. No armies marched. It began with parchment and unsigned documents, a challenge over a property sale. In the spring of 1440, Gilles had negotiated the sale of a small but significant church St. Tiee a mort to a local cleric. The transaction itself was of little consequence in terms of wealth. What made it dangerous was jurisdiction. Gilles had failed to seek approval from his feudal overlord, Duke Jean of Brittany. This omission, deliberate or not, gave the Duke precisely what he had been waiting for, an opportunity. Rumors about the Baron's erratic behavior had reached the court years earlier. Whispers of strange expenditures, of missing children, of rites held under moonlight. But whispers are not evidence. The Duke had no legal standing to act until now. Gilles' response to the dispute was characteristic of his recent temperament. Rather than negotiate or apologize, he armed his men and marched into the church. What followed was an act of pure arrogance. Clergy were assaulted, sacred objects overturned, and the cleric who had received the sale was violently ejected. This time, silence could not follow. It wasn't only a matter of civil disobedience, it was an attack on the church itself. Within days, envoys from the Duke of Brittany began circling Gilles' lands, not with swords, but with scrolls. The legal machinery, long dormant in his territories, began to grind into motion. Letters were written, warrants were prepared, informants were questioned, and then, without warning, the storm arrived. On September 15, 1440, forces loyal to the Duke moved on Gilles Castle at Machecoul. They came not in an open siege, but in coordinated silence. His gates were breached, his halls swept clean of retainers. Gilles was seized without resistance. In another era, in another war, it might have taken thousands. On this day, a dozen well-armed men were enough. He was not the only one taken. Francesco Prelati was apprehended, dragged from his quarters with a ledger tucked beneath his robes. Two of Gilles' most trusted household men, Henry Gris and Chen Corrales, known to many simply as Poitou, were captured on the same day. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. The Duke had waited, had watched, had planned. Within hours, the web had been cut. Gilles was taken to Nantes, to a fortified holding tower where he awaited trial. At first, he said nothing. He remained composed, even disdainful. He believed that no court would dare truly pursue the charges that had begun to emerge. After all, he was Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, companion of Joan of Arc, a man who had spilled his blood for the crown. But titles fade quickly under torchlight. The investigation began with property, but it did not end there. As agents of the Duke began searching Gilles' many estates, what they found defied even the worst suspicions. In the lower chambers of Machecoul and Tiforges, locked behind iron doors and sealed with wax, were rooms that had not been entered in years. Rooms lined with stone slabs stained black, their floors fitted with grooves designed not for drainage, but for collection. Rooms that smelled not simply of decay, but of something burned long ago and never forgotten. They found vessels made of brass, their interiors crusted with a reddish-black residue. Furnaces still warm despite disuse. Piles of scorched ash mixed with bone splinters. Beneath one staircase, they uncovered a trench lined with lime, a crude burial site, recently disturbed. Worst of all were the shelves. On them, lined like trophies, were objects that defied every natural instinct. Skulls not old enough to be forgotten, some bleached, others still bearing the remnants of skin or cloth. Each one marked, each one kept. For the first time, the rumors were no longer just words. They were rooms, they were stains, they were faces without names. The interrogations began immediately. Gilles, at first, refused to cooperate. He denied all allegations. He mocked the court's authority, but his men, his loyal inner circle, cracked faster than expected. Henry Gris was the first to speak. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps he had simply seen too much to carry alone. His confession was slow at first, broken sentences, references to rituals, unlocked doors. But as the hours passed and the interrogators leaned harder, the stories poured forth. He spoke of how boys were chosen, how the Baron instructed them to seek out those with clean spirits and unspoiled voices. He described the process, from invitation to disappearance, of how children would be given fine meals and expensive clothing, paraded before guests, and then led to the lower chambers, of how Gilles would descend in ceremonial robes, clutching books with no titles and muttering in tongues no priest would recognize. He spoke of the noises, the incantations, the wet sounds, the crying, and the silence that always followed. Poitou was next. His testimony mirrored Henry's, but added detail. He described not just the chambers, but their design, how every stone was carefully chosen, how the lighting was adjusted to flicker in rhythm with chanting. He described one ritual where a boy was offered as courtesy to a spirit Gilles believed would restore his wealth. The child's name was never known, he was only remembered by the color of his eyes. More rooms were searched, more remains discovered. Gilles, once the defiant noble, began to falter. At one point, he was told that he would be excommunicated, that he would die outside the church, buried in unmarked soil, his soul condemned to wander without prayer. That broke him. His confession came in bursts, initially guarded, then impossibly detailed. He spoke not only of actions, but of intent. He described the ceremonies. He explained why they had to be done, how Prelati had shown him diagrams, circles layered with signs of old power, how certain offerings needed to be given during specific phases of the moon, how the innocence of a child's blood could call the invisible more effectively than any relic or relic's bone. He spoke of ecstasy, not of physical pleasure, but of a kind of spiritual seizure that overtook him during the offerings, how he believed the spirits surrounded him, watching, judging, how he tried to please them, how he failed, and how each failure required a higher price. He spoke of the records he kept, how he wrote down not only names and dates, but the outcome of each offering, whether the ritual worked, whether a sign appeared. He believed, to the very end, that he had come close to breaking the boundary between worlds, that just one more life might have opened the door. The court was silent as he spoke, not from doubt but from horror. The judges wept. The scribes could not write quickly enough. Those who listened to the full testimony would later speak of sleepless nights, of prayers offered not for Gilles, but for the souls of the children who never returned. The records of that trial still exist, locked in vaults beneath French cathedrals, preserved in fading ink. They are not stories, they are transcripts, the words of men who did not believe in monsters until they saw one in velvet. The trial lasted several weeks. Each day brought new testimony, new witnesses, new horrors. Families came forward with stories of lost sons. Servants confirmed that orders were given to burn clothing, to clean bloodstains from walls. Alchemists were called to verify the symbols found on walls and books. Priests attempted to translate the prayers muttered during rituals and failed. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was sentenced. He would be hanged until his breath failed him, then burned, so that nothing of him remained. But even in his execution, the church offered mercy. His body was allowed to be removed from the flames before total disintegration. It was buried on consecrated ground just beyond the city walls. Thousands came to witness it, not because they hated him, not because they pitied him, but because they needed to see it end. They needed to know that the man who had smiled among angels and demons alike would not walk the earth again. And yet, even as the ashes cooled and the castles were sealed, questions remained. The fall of Gilles de Rais began not with justice, nor morality, nor even an act of courage. It began with pride. In the spring of 1440, Gilles became embroiled in a dispute with a local cleric over a property in the Saint-Chen-de-Montmort, a small but symbolically important church nestled on land Gilles claimed as his own. The cleric, acting with permission from the Duke of Brittany, arrived to take possession. Gilles, insulted that such a transfer could occur without his consent, responded not with lawyers, but with force. He assembled a group of armed men and stormed the church. Witnesses later described the assault as sudden, theatrical, and deeply sacrilegious. Candles were knocked from altars. Clergy were manhandled. Gilles stood at the center, his voice rising like thunder as he proclaimed the land his, defying both duke and church. It was, in many ways, a familiar act of noble arrogance. But the world around Gilles had changed. The Duke of Brittany, Joan V, had grown increasingly uneasy with Gilles' erratic behavior, his extravagant spending, and the growing rumors surrounding him. This assault on a sacred institution committed in broad daylight, witnessed by many, gave the Duke the opening he needed. It was not justice, it was an opportunity. Within weeks, secret orders were written, letters were exchanged, witnesses were summoned quietly under the pretense of accounting disputes, and on September 15, 1440, with the precision of a military operation, Gilles de Rais was arrested at his castle in Marshal. The soldiers arrived at dawn. No trumpets, no warning. His servants were disarmed. His closest associates, including the enigmatic Francesco Prelati, and to longtime retainers Henry Guy and Chen Corrault, known as Poitou, were also taken into custody, pulled from their beds or their rituals, and separated into isolated cells before they could speak to one another. At first, the official charges made little mention of children. The initial accusations focused on the unlawful seizure of church property and conduct unbecoming of a noble. It was a deliberate move, a calculated first step to see how far the net could be cast. But the men interrogating Gilles were not interested in legal technicalities. They wanted answers about the children, and soon they would have them. As word of the arrest spread through Brittany and Anjou, something remarkable happened. People began to talk, not servants or nobles but villagers, peasants, parents, men and women who had whispered their suspicions for years now saw the chance to be heard. They came to investigators with trembling hands and tight voices. They brought names, dates, faces. The smith from La Roche, who hadn't seen his son since the boy had gone to serve at the castle. The widow from Nantul, who'd been promised a job for her youngest, only to receive silence. The shepherd's mother, whose boy vanished while delivering wool. All of them had believed they were alone. Now they realized they were part of something larger, something monstrous. Investigators descended upon Gilles properties. What they found was worse than rumor. At Tiff orgies, they uncovered a locked chamber deep beneath the castle's foundation, sealed with iron and marked with symbols scorched into the stone. Inside, the air was thick and stale, almost sweet with rot. The walls bore scratch marks. The floor was grooved from movement that did not come from furniture. In the corners, fragments of clothing, small tunics, shoes, ribbons lay discarded as if forgotten. There were stone basins stained dark, fire pits lined with ash and bones. In Marshal, one investigator reported a room filled with what appeared to be jars of fluid, preserved parts, catalogued and organized by size and shape. Another chamber contained crude sketches and anatomical drawings, annotated in Gilles' unmistakable hand. They did not need confessions. The evidence screamed, but they got confessions anyway. The first to speak was Poitou. He broke quickly under questioning, not from torture, but from fear. He described how Gilles had orchestrated the disappearances, how boys would be brought to the castle under the guise of employment or service, welcomed like honored guests. They were fed, clothed, even entertained. Then one evening, Gilles would summon them. Poitou's voice reportedly trembled when he described what followed. He spoke of rituals, some religious, others unrecognizable. He described the private theater room, transformed into something far darker, where Gilles would first speak kindly to the boys, ask them about their families, their dreams, their prayers. This, he said, was part of it. Gilles liked to know what they loved before he took it away. Once Gilles felt the moment had arrived, the room would change. Candles extinguished, incense lit, silence demanded. What followed was precise, methodical, cold. Poitou did not describe it all. He could not. But the fragments were enough. Henry Gris was next. He lasted longer, tried to deny, then deflect, then plead. But the details he finally confessed matched those of Poitou. More than that, they expanded upon them. He described Gilles' collection of mementos, his private quarters, where preserved objects were laid out like relics, the golden ledger, where each guest was recorded not just by name, but by quality. The purity of the soul, Gris said, was especially prized. But the one they truly wanted was Gilles himself. For weeks, he refused to cooperate. He dismissed the charges as absurd. He claimed political persecution, betrayal, and slander. He stood in court with the haughty confidence of a noble long accustomed to immunity. He smiled, but then came the threat, not of physical pain, but of spiritual exile. The church announced its intent to excommunicate him, cutting him off from communion, from heaven, from salvation. Gilles, for all his rituals and alliances, had been raised in the fear of eternal darkness. The reality of dying outside the church's grace frightened him more than any blade. And so, he spoke, before a packed courtroom. Clergy, nobles, peasants alike. Gilles de Rais began to describe what he had done. He did not weep, he did not stutter. His voice was calm, measured, almost clinical. He described how he had fallen under the influence of prelati, how he had believed the rituals would bring him wealth, protection, immortality. He detailed how children were selected, lured, observed, and eventually taken. He confessed to the preservation of parts, to the record keeping, to the conversations he had with the remains. He admitted that sometimes he believed he could still hear them, that they whispered to him in the dark, that they guided his hand. At times, his voice grew almost tender. He described the beauty of certain boys, their laughter, the trust in their eyes. How breaking that trust became part of the ritual, part of the power. How their final moments felt sacred. The courtroom fell into a silence, so complete it became a presence in itself. And then he said the number. Not one, not 10, not dozens, hundreds. Some accounts claim he admitted to over 140. Others suggest he acknowledged more than 800 children, taken over 8 years. No one knows the exact number, not even Gilles. He said that at some point, the rituals became habits, that the gold, the power was forgotten. Only the act remained, only the moment, and then, nothing but quiet. When he finished, there was no applause, no gasps, only the scraping of the scribe's pen, the quiet sobbing of mothers, the trembling breath of an old priest trying to remember how to pray. His fate was sealed, but his legacy had only begun to bloom. It began, as many of history's great catastrophes do, not with outrage or justice, but with paperwork. In the spring of 1440, Gilles de Rais, now deep in his obsession with the occult and surrounded by an increasingly secretive inner circle, made a fatal error. It wasn't a mistake of ritual or a moment of moral hesitation. It was administrative. He attempted to sell a church, specifically the Church of St. Diene an old structure nestled on land that technically did not belong to him. The church stood within the jurisdiction of the Duke of Brittany, and Gilles, despite all his titles and military honors, was still a vassal bound by the rules of feudal law. By bypassing the Duke's authority and transferring the property to a local cleric, Gilles violated not only secular boundaries, but sacred ones as well. When church officials arrived to enforce the Duke's claim, Gilles did not respond with negotiation or diplomacy. He responded with violence. Armed men loyal to him descended on the site, ejecting the priests and their attendants with drawn swords and shouted threats. The clash was brief, but it was enough to attract the Duke's attention, enough to crack open the door that had long protected Gilles from scrutiny. Jean V, Duke of Brittany, had already grown uneasy about Gilles. Rumors of disappearances had long whispered their way through the lower nobility and clergy. Strange expenses, unexplainable debts, complaints from peasants that vanished into silence. Gilles' once glittering reputation had dulled with time and extravagance. His former glory was now a mask stretched over the increasingly visible face of decay. And now, this attack on church property, a direct insult to both secular and religious authority, provided the perfect justification to act. On September 15, 1440, without warning, forces loyal to the Duke arrived at the castle of Machecoul. They came not with trumpets or declarations, but with deliberate coordination and quiet authority. Gilles was arrested swiftly, without resistance. His most trusted attendants, men who had followed him from the battlefield into the shadows, were taken into custody as well. Among them were Chen Corot, known as Poitou, Henriette, and the enigmatic Francesco Prelati. The arrests were synchronized. Other castles under Gilles' control were quietly entered, sealed off, and searched. The intent was clear. There would be no time to destroy evidence. Whatever had been hidden for years would now be exposed to the light. At first, the official charge was limited to the conflict over church land, but those who orchestrated the arrest knew that the land dispute was merely a mask for something far darker. As investigators began to search the properties more thoroughly, they encountered things no man of the cloth or sword had been prepared for. In the lower levels of the castles, behind bolted doors and heavy iron gates, they found chambers that did not belong to any known floor plan. Hidden rooms with thick stone walls and no windows. Rooms that smelled of smoke, rot, and something worse, an oily sweetness that clung to the nostrils and made the stomach turn. Inside those rooms, they discovered objects no noble household should possess. Chains fixed to stone walls, stained with what appeared to be rust but smelled like iron and salt. Metal implements laid out on tables with surgical precision hooks, pincers, blades sharpened to finely for hunting, drainage channels carved into the floors, sloped toward dark grates, furnaces with scorched bones buried in their ash. And then there were the remains. They did not come in piles. They were scattered, hidden in crawl spaces, behind loose stones, beneath flagstones hastily resealed with mortar. Some were old, skeletal. Others still clung to the last ghostly suggestions of flesh, the remains of children, many small, many fragmented, bones with markings too deliberate to be from animals, too cruel to be accidental. In the gardens, in the wells, in the shallow woods surrounding the castles, more bones were found. The scale of the discovery horrified even the most hardened among the investigators, not only because of what was found but because of what it implied. This was not the result of a single outburst or madness. This was systematic, repeated, planned, but the physical evidence, grim as it was, only told part of the story. The rest came from the mouths of Gilles' own men. At first, they resisted questioning. Their loyalty was real, built not only on fear, but on years of intimacy and privilege. But that resistance broke under pressure, under the threat of torture, execution, or eternal condemnation by the church. The silence shattered. Henriette was the first to speak. He described the selection process, how Gilles would instruct his men to search surrounding villages for boys who fit a specific profile: young, well-featured, obedient. The pretense was always the same: employment in the baron's household, a place in the choir, or a future at court. The boys were taken to one of the castles. They were treated kindly at first, fed well, dressed in fine clothing, shown rooms filled with books and instruments. They were told they were special, chosen. Then, one night, Gilles would summon them to the lower floors. What happened there, Henriette said, could not be explained in any language fit for the world above. Poitou's confession was worse. He spoke of rituals, of the way Gilles would dress himself in ceremonial robes, red, black, sometimes trimmed with silver or bone. He would begin by speaking to the children, softly, asking them about their families, their favorite foods, their dreams. He wanted them calm. Then he would begin. Some were strangled, some were opened with precision. Some endured hours of what Gilles called transfiguration. He believed he was transforming them, purify them, offering them to something beyond himself. He would collect the heads, wash them, speak to them, name them. He believed they remembered him. Poitiers said that Gilles laughed during these acts, not the laughter of madness, but the laughter of someone finally feeling in control. He documented everything. In his study, investigators found books written in Gilles hand ledgers, essays, ritual instructions. One ledger listed the names of boys, their ages, the dates they arrived, the days they were released. None had ever left. The trial was scheduled with haste. The court in Nantes convened on October 13, 1440, with both secular and ecclesiastical judges presiding. Gilles stood accused of heresy, occult practices, and the ending of innocent lives. At first, he denied everything. He challenged the court's authority. He claimed the accusations were fabricated, the result of political jealousy and vendetta. He invoked his noble lineage, his military honors, his service to France. But the weight of evidence crushed such defenses. Witnesses came forward. Parents, servants, laborers, all told similar stories. A child offered into Gilles' care, never to be seen again. Disappearances that had been ignored or explained away now formed a constellation of horror. The court threatened Gilles with excommunication of fate, considered more terrifying than any earthly punishment. The threat of eternal spiritual abandonment finally broke him. He confessed. What followed was a testimony that would be recorded in detail, not only by clerks, but by horrified chroniclers for generations to come. Gilles described what he had done not with wild theatrics, but with a calmness that unsettled the entire court. He spoke of his descent as a form of spiritual awakening, of prelatist teachings, of the rituals, of the children. He spoke of the euphoria he felt during these acts, of the sense of communion with entities beyond this world, of the belief that each act brought him closer to a promised transformation. He admitted to dozens, then hundreds of deaths. He described in detail the physical and emotional manipulation, the preservation of heads, the burning of remains, the way ash was mixed with dirt to avoid detection. He did not beg for mercy. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply spoke. On October 26, 1440, judgment was delivered. Gilles de Rais would face death not as a nobleman, not as a war hero, not as a saint's companion, but as something else entirely, something no title could cleanse. The sentence was carried out that same day. It was spring when the first real threat to Gilles' sanctuary came not from the church, nor from outraged parents, but from a transaction that should have passed unnoticed. A modest chapel, nestled within one of his many properties, transferred into the hands of a local cleric. On parchment, it was a simple exchange. The Church of St. Maire-Morte, a small but respected site of worship in Brittany, was sold to a priest who believed he had the authority to claim it. But in the convoluted feudal structure of medieval France, nothing was ever so direct. The land, although legally Gilles to manage, technically fell under the jurisdiction of Duke Jean of Brittany, his feudal superior, and that duke had not granted permission for the sale. Gilles, by this point, was no longer a baron known for negotiation. His years of seclusion, unchecked control, and intoxicating ritual had left him volatile. When church officials attempted to finalize the sale and claim the building, they were met not with legal resistance, but with fury. Gilles arrived at the chapel not in robes of negotiation, but in armor. Leading a band of armed men, he burst into the church, ordered the clergy to leave, and when they refused, had them forcefully ejected. Some were beaten, others were humiliated in public. It was not a subtle protest, it was a declaration. To the church, it was an attack on sacred ground. To the Duke of Brittany, it was insubordination. To those who had been watching, whispering it was the excuse they needed, the Duke, long aware of Gilles' deteriorating behavior and rumored cruelty, saw the opportunity clearly. Here, finally, was legal grounds to intervene, not allegations, not suspicions, a direct offense against both church and feudal order. And just like that, the storm broke. Within weeks, arrest warrants were issued, not just for Gilles, but for his inner circle. Francesco Prelati, Henriette, Poitou, others whose names had never reached the ears of the public, but whose hands had turned keys to locked doors, carried out instructions too grim to speak, disposed of things that could not be buried. On September 15, 1440, forces loyal to the Duke descended on Michekel. They did not knock. The castle, often quiet and guarded, was surrounded before sunrise. The gates, massive and old, gave way to pressure from men who now carried royal permission. Gilles, reportedly asleep in his chambers, was taken without resistance. He did not call for aid. He did not protest. He simply asked one question: "Is this for the chapel?" The answer, of course, was no. Simultaneously, Prelati and the others were taken into custody, some from inns where they had fled, others from the basements of properties thought abandoned. What followed was a coordinated investigation of Gilles' estates, and it was here that the true horror began to surface. At first, the soldiers and clerics who entered the sealed rooms did not understand what they were seeing. The chambers below the castle were not designed like dungeons. They were too clean, too deliberate. The floors sloped subtly toward drains. The walls had been treated to prevent absorption. Implements were arranged on tables not like weapons of war, but like surgical tools. They were chained small, precise, affixed at varying heights as if for specific body sizes. But most disturbing of all was the smell. It was not fresh, not pungent, but it was there, faint, thick, and wrong. And then came the discovery of remains. Some were recent fragments hidden beneath flagstones, bones buried beneath the hearth. Others had been partially preserved, treated with oils and wrapped in fine linens. Dozens of skulls, some bleached, others still marked by soft tissue, were discovered in locked trunks or behind false walls. There were preserved heads with glassy eyes and parted lips, positioned as though they had once sat on shelves for display. One chamber painted with symbols in chalk and rust-colored stains contained rows of shelves, lined with carefully catalogued items, garments, shoes, locks of hair, each wrapped and labeled in Gilles' own hand. The ledger was found next. It was bound in leather, dense with notes, and organized with unsettling precision. Each entry documented the arrival of a new guest name, age, village, date of entry. A second column noted departure. Many included a single stroke across the page, others a symbol. A few were marked with what investigators would later interpret as ritual terms: purified, offered, yielded. When these findings were brought to the attention of ecclesiastical authorities, the case transformed. This was no longer about a land dispute. It was no longer about insubordination or even heresy. This was something much worse. A special ecclesiastical tribunal was formed in Nantes. The church and secular authorities would collaborate, an unusual alliance reserved for only the gravest of offences. Gilles, once too noble to accuse, now stood before judges who demanded answers, not just for the missing children, but for the things they had seen. And then came the testimonies. Henriette was the first to speak, broken, frightened, and aware that silence would mean the same fate as his master. He described what had happened behind those locked doors. His voice reportedly trembled as he spoke of the selection process, how boys were chosen, how they were brought in with kindness, fed, dressed, shown comfort, and then how that comfort was withdrawn. The description of the ceremonies was haunting. Gilles would don ceremonial garments deep blue, trimmed with silver, and enter the chamber alone. Sometimes he brought a book. Other times, he entered in silence. The children would be bound not in panic, but in confusion. What followed, Henriette claimed, was a transformation. The nobleman who once debated military strategy spoke in tongues. His voice changed, deeper and slower. He would chant over the child, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing. He would question them not with rage, but with affection, asking them about their parents, their dreams, the things they feared most. The pain, Henriette claimed, was never swift. Gilles had become obsessed with drawing out the moment. He believed suffering created a resonance that spirits could detect, that the exact moment when hope left the body created a kind of doorway. What disturbed the tribunal most was not the act itself, but the consistency. The routine. Gilles did not behave like a madman, they noted. He behaved like a priest performing sacraments. Potter corroborated the story. He added that sometimes Gilles kept the remains 4 days, tending to them, whispering to them, that he believed the spirits of the departed lingered near their physical form and could be kept calm through conversation. The court was silent when this was read aloud. The public, however, had no such restraint. Rumors exploded. Parents who had once wondered about the fate of their missing sons now had answers, though none they wanted. The number of victims was estimated at over 100. Some claimed it exceeded 600. Others spoke of 800. The truth was no longer numeric. It was weight and emotional, spiritual weight that settled over France like an eclipse. Still, Gilles remained stoic. He denied everything at first, mocked the authority of the court, even claimed that, as a Marshal of France, no earthly judge had the right to question him. He had stood beside Joan. He had been blessed by kings. These peasants, these clergymen, these petty dukes, they had no claim over his soul. But then the threat came, excommunication. To a man obsessed with spiritual resonance and ritual purity, the threat of being cut off from the church, of being denied absolution, of being erased from God's light was unbearable. His resolve broke, and he confessed. The courtroom, packed with nobles and clergy, listened in horrified silence as Gilles de Rais, once France's golden soldier, described with calm precision how he had begun with desperation and ended in obsession. He described his first ritual with prelati, how he had waited for a sign, any sign, that the spirits would answer, how the silence after the offering had driven him to try again and again. He confessed to using pain to open spiritual doors. He spoke of voices, dreams, promises whispered in the dark. He spoke not like a man caught, but like a man finally unburdening a weight too large to carry alone. He did not beg for mercy. He only asked one thing, that his body be buried in consecrated ground.